In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the growth of Islam and the split into Sunnism and Shiaism. The conflict between Islam's two major sects has lasted over 1,300 years and started with a war over control of the Caliphate. We're going to dive into these issues, and after we're done, you'll understand the diversity of belief in Islam and make better sense of the violent conflicts between Muslims in places like Iraq and Lebanon that in some ways aren't so different from the Christian conflicts of the past that took place in the Reformation, even up to more recent times, like the conflict between Irish Catholics and Protestants in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. Okay, so the two major sects of Islam are Sunnism and Shiaism. If you don't know the difference between these two, don't worry, many people don't. In fact, in 2006, experts in Washington, D.C. were asked this very same question. What's the difference between Sunnis and Shiites? This included members of Congress, FBI officials, counterterrorism experts, and even people who were on government panels who had to make major foreign policy decisions in the Middle East. While the answer might seem only important to Trivial Pursuit matters, understanding the difference is very important for making sense of the constant infighting that takes place in the Middle East between Muslim groups. Some examples of this are the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, the former nation being Sunni and the latter being Shiite. And you can also see this in the major conflict that happened during the Iraq insurgency when it was at its height in 2007, and other parts of the Middle East, and even saber rattling between Iran and other countries, Iran being Shiite. First, we'll look into the expansion of Islam and see how these conflicts developed. The origin of the split comes from the expansion of Islam. As it spread from Baghdad to France over a 100-year period, differences started to appear between these different Muslim groups due to cultural, linguistic differences, and other things. And the differences appeared much like the split in Christianity between Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and later on Protestants. After the death of Muhammad, the Muslim community chose a replacement as the leader of their religion. This person was known as the Caliph, which means a successor or representative in Arabic, and the domain of his leadership was known as the Caliphate. So that's what we mean when we talk about caliphates. The Caliph maintained both spiritual and political power over his subjects, similar to the Pope in the Middle Ages. But unlike the Pope, the Caliph was only recognized as the universal head of his religion for only a few decades before the community split up. Let's just do a brief overview of the first three caliphs. The first was Abu Bakr. He was among the first converts to Islam and the father-in-law to Muhammad, who married his daughter Aisha. The second was Omar, who led Muslim armies against the Byzantine Empire to the north and completely enveloped the Persian Empire in 636, which had existed for 1,000 years. The Pact of Umar, which was how Muslims dealt with Christians socially and after military defeat, is a major piece of legislation that affects interreligious relations for a long time, and we'll look at that more closely in a later lesson. The third caliph was Uthman. Under his reign, the Caliphate expanded to encompass major regions across the world, extending from Armenia to Algeria. He was also responsible for collecting the prophecies of Muhammad and compiling them into one book. So this is where the Quran appears for the first time as a printed book. But he wasn't without dissenters because many thought that Uthman had given an unfair proportion of the spoils of war to his own tribe, the Umayyads. Because of this, he was assassinated by rebels and the reign of Ali, the fourth caliph, began. And it's in the reigns of the third and fourth caliph where these divisions begin to emerge and where the seeds are planted for the splits into Sunnism and Shiism. The conflict between the tribes loyal to Uthman, which became the Umayyads, and the tribes loyal to Ali led to an all-out civil war in 657. The two groups ultimately declared a truce, but Ali's followers were so angered with him for doing so that they assassinated him. The followers of Ali may have killed their leader, but they were still loyal to his cause, feeling that the center of gravity of the Islamic world should be in Arabia, not amongst the Umayyads who were in Syria, and they felt marginalized by them. So Ali's sons Hassan and Hussein staged another battle against the Umayyads in 680 in Iraq. Hussein was killed, and his martyrdom is central to the Shiite movement today. Pictures of him usually appear at protest rallies in Iran, so he's been appropriated as a political symbol as well. Let's look a little bit closely into some of the major things that happened during the reigns of the first four caliphs. Abu Bakr, as you can see, he only reigned for 2 years, so not a lot happens. Umar, the Arab armies defeat the Byzantine armies, particularly the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. This is where major expansion happens within the Near East, and they envelop the Sasanian Empire, or Iraq, particularly at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. Uthman's time sees the limits of expansion, consolidation, and the formation of the Quran. And with Ali, he was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, married Fatima, and here's where you see the first civil war in Islam taking place, known as the Fitna, and it results from him fighting the descendants of Uthman and the Umayyads. There's a map there that shows some of the Byzantine troop movements and Muslim troop movements, and all of the political conflict and military conflict that's happening in Syria in the 630s. It's at this point where the Byzantine Empire is sending hundreds of thousands of troops to try to stamp out this upstart religion once and for all, but ultimately they have to pull out of the Near East, which was, at the time, their most prosperous province. Here you can see the political expansion and military expansion of the Umayyad Empire, lasting from 661 to 750. This is after the first four caliphs. Really dramatic expansion, going far outside of the traditional domains of Islam, just a generation earlier, all the way from Central Asia into North Africa and up into Spain. So absolutely massive growth that at this time, the world hadn't seen something like this for centuries. I mean, this resembles something like Alexander the Great in terms of massive and very quick military expansion. Okay, so how did the four rightly guided caliphs, their reign end, and what happened to set up the first Muslim dynasty? It happened with Muawiyah and the establishment of the Umayyad Caliph. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was the son of Abu Sufyan, a companion of Muhammad. He was also Uthman's nephew and from the tribe of the Umayyads and a governor of Syria. So he was much more connected to Syria than Arabia. At this time, Damascus with his reign becomes the center of Muslim political and economic power. It's not northern Arabia or Mecca or Medina anymore. Because of this, there's resentment in these areas from Arab tribes who feel like they're being marginalized by these other groups in Syria. He was a very skillful leader, Muawiyah, but the reason his reign was controversial was because he established a dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, by appointing his son. Now reign and political power transfers from father to son, not being elected by the Muslim community as it was with the first four caliphs. There's a global perspective of the extents of the Umayyad Caliphate. So dialing in a little bit closer to the first civil war, or Fitna, which happens, the seeds of this are planted with the reign of Uthman, the third rightly guided caliph. Many resented that he only chose to empower members of his own Umayyad clan. The reason is because after battle, the booty, the spoils of war, was going to a central treasury that he created. Basically, the Umayyad clansmen and the Quraysh elite received the best lands, the best spoils, whereas other groups, regardless of how much they actually participated in battle, weren't receiving a more proportionate share like they were in the earlier years of Islam. Ali, the next caliph, gave a constant critique of the Meccan elites, and he was always concerned with those on the margins and those marginalized by the society. So here's where the names come from of Sunni and Shia. Party, which is what Shia means, of Ali versus the party of Mecca, Aisha, resulted in the Battle of the Camel in 656 in Basra, Iraq. So what's the result? We see the Umayyads and the party of Muawiyah fighting. The Battle of Siffin is the party of Ali versus the party of Muawiyah. There's ultimately a truce between these two, but the Kharijites were among Ali's own partisans who were furious at this truce, and they killed Ali for making peace with Muawiyah. As a result of Ali's party being marginalized, in 661 Muawiyah claims the Caliphate, and he moves the capital to Damascus away from the Meccan elite, partly to be free from the politics and squabbling of this area, but also to consolidate power and favor his own tribe, which is centralized here. Here's an artistic depiction of this battle. Okay, so what were the issues resulting from this first civil war? There's a question of justice, whether Uthman was ruled justly or not by favoring his own tribe, and whether or not his murder was just. Yes, he may have ruled unjustly. Yes, he may not have distributed spoils equally, but he was still the caliph and the successor of the prophet. So this was a major question. As a result of this, Damascus flourishes at the expense of Medina and Hijaz. And this is very important because the center of Islam moves from Arabia to Syria, which was a very important province in the Byzantine Empire. It's at this time where classical Islam takes on a lot of Near Eastern forms. They take on a lot of imperial forms, they copy a lot of Byzantine architecture, they mint coins, they adopt bureaucracy and administrative forms that resemble Byzantium. So a classical empire that was in the Near East, Romans, Byzantines, the Islamic Caliph, the Islamic now copies these forms a lot and incorporates it into their own. So you see a lot of imperial infrastructure really coming about at this time. The Second Civil War was in 680 to 692. Here, Muawiyah chose his son Yazid I to reign, and this is what formally sets up the Umayyad dynasty, because reign now transfers from father to son. And like I said earlier, the sons of Ali and Fatima, Hassan and Hussein, the supporters see Hassan as the rightful caliph, and Ali's supporters become Shia. At the Battle of Karbala in 680, Yazid surprises Hussein and kills most Shia. Hussein's martyrdom central to the Shia movement. So the Shias here you see are partisans, and they're against the Umayyad Caliphate, but they still consider themselves Muslims. So here you see a question of succession. Both parties believe that they are in the true line of Islam, and the other has branched off and forked into a wrong direction. It's not too dissimilar from a difference in thought between Eastern Orthodox and Catholics, where Catholics believed the correct branch was following a system in which there is one head of the church, the Pope, whereas the Orthodox believed in a more federal structure where there centers autocephalous patriarchates broken up and under the rule of an individual patriarch. Both sides believe that they're the true branch and true continuation of their religion, much like Sunnis and Shias. There's the Ibn al-Zubayr rebellion after Yazid dies, represented by non-Umayyads in the Hijaz. So you see continual conflict between these groups, and there's sort of permanent division now within the body of Islam. So as you can see, those are pictures being held up of Hussein at a protest rally in Iran, and he's still very much a political symbol. Okay, so some of the legacies of the Umayyad period, when a dynasty is set up, is, like I said before, a lot of the imperial trappings of an empire really start to cover over Islam. There's bureaucratization, divans, also a cultural Arabization that takes place in the Near East, where other languages like Greek or Syriac are pushed out in favor of Arabic. Under the reign of Abd al-Malik, the first Muslim Arabic coins were minted, This is a very important symbol that you're an imperial ruler, that you have coins with a picture of the ruler, think of Roman coins with emperors on it, and also proclaiming independence. This ruler, Abd al-Malik, furthers conquests of the Umayyads into Transoxania, which is in Central Asia, up to India, Spain, and even raids into France. Raids of Constantinople are included. Here, you also see khutbah, which are Friday sermons, and it's customary at these sermons to name the ruler who controls the domain in which the imam is speaking, or the preacher. So you see the stamp of imperial power and Islam mixing together. Also, the Dome of the Rock mosque in Jerusalem is built at this time. So you see certain architectural styles emerging that really resemble Byzantine churches. And there's lasting infrastructure that's left behind and even irrigation systems. There's some pictures of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. If you look at the dome, it's not too much different from what would be a classical Byzantine church. We saw a lesson or two ago, the Hagia Sophia, the Hagia Sophia Basilica, and in terms of the dome, not terribly different. Okay, so there's still cultural differences today between Sunnis and Shias. Some of the main differences that have sprung up with them over the centuries, for example, Shiite boys are often named Ali or Hassan, while the names Omar, Uthman, or Abu Bakr are popular with Sunnis. Additionally, some ultra-Orthodox Shias will whip themselves on the holiday of Ashura to commemorate the deaths of Hassan and Hussein. Interestingly enough, these differences even affect how the groups dress. Your average Sunni and Shia look quite a bit alike, but a pious Shia Muslim doesn't wear a necktie. If you've seen pictures of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the bombastic former president of Iran, he never wears a necktie in public, and an equally pious Sunni might sport a long beard, believing it's important to follow in the customs and even the physical appearance of the Prophet. Okay, so that was an overview of the split between Sunnis and Shias. We're going to jump ahead a century in the next lecture and look at what is considered to be the golden age of Islam, which is the Abbasid Empire.